biggest names had begun to ask themselves where exactly Suge Knight was leading them. "This is some serious shit," said an obviously daunted Snoop outside the courtroom, where he stood wearing a suit and tie that had replaced the flannel shirts he'd worn early in the trial. The charges against the rapper arose from a killing almost 3 years earlier, in which a 20-year-old Ethiopian named Philip Waldemariam was shot in the back by Snoop's bodyguard, McKinley Lee. Apart from Snoop's celebrity, the scenarios of Waldemariam's death offered by both prosecution and defense were depressingly familiar. The incident began outside Snoop's apartment in Palms, each side agreed, when Snoop's friend Sean Abrams flashed a gang sign at Waldemariam as the young Ethiopian and two of his friends drove past. The car stopped, epithets were exchanged, and Snoop's bodyguard Lee ran downstairs to intervene. Waldemariam and friends drove away, but less than an hour later, Snoop was behind the wheel of his Jeep with Lee in the passenger seat and Abrams in the back as they prowled the neighborhood. The three found Waldemariam and his friends at nearby Woodbine Park, where the group was dining on takeout Mexican food. What happened next was a matter of dispute. According to the defense attorneys, David Kenner for Snoop, Johnny Cochran for Abrams, and Donald Ray for Lee, Waldemariam reached for the .38 he wore in his waistband, forcing McKinley Lee to draw his own gun and shoot the Ethiopian in self-defense. The prosecution countered that Snoop and his friends had pursued Waldemariam to the park and that the shots fired by Lee had hit the Ethiopian in his buttocks and back. How could that be self-defense? Apart from Snoop's celebrity status, among those who made an appearance in court to show their support were Suge Knight, MC Hammer, and Tupac Shakur. The defense had three major advantages. The first was Kenner, who hammered at several key prosecution witnesses so relentlessly that jurors sat shaking their heads and suppressing smiles. Secondly, one of Philip Waldemariam's companions astounded the prosecution by changing his story, explaining in court that the Ethiopian had reached for his gun, and that after the shooting, he and Waldemariam's other companion removed the gun from their friend's hand to ensure Snoop's conviction. Thirdly, key evidence in the case that included bloody clothing and shell casings had been destroyed or removed from the property room at the LAPD's Pacific Division. The jury returned not guilty verdicts on all counts. Snoop was collected outside the criminal courts building by a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce dispatched by Suge Knight. That evening, Snoop joined Suge and his entourage for a party at Monty's Steakhouse, where guests, who included not only Tupac and Hammer, but also several members of the jury, dined on crab legs and lobster tails. Though all smiles that evening, Snoop was badly shaken by his ordeal. Within a matter of months, he would begin talking about the change of direction that resulted eventually in his parting of the ways with Suge Knight and Death Row Records. Others, though, would leave first. The only performer to meet Suge head-on was RBX, who also happened to be the single Death Row rapper who was a match for him physically. The beef between the two had started in a dressing room at the New Regal Theater on Chicago's South Side, over something so stupid that those who heard the story could barely believe it. Suge had become infuriated when RBX ate some fried chicken Knight had ordered for his homeboys. An incredulous RBX stayed right in Suge's face until Knight pulled out a pistol and handed it to one of his homies. "If I whoop your ass, this nigga's likely to shoot me," RBX observed. Violence was averted when Snoop Dogg reminded Suge that RBX was his cousin and said to please let it pass, but the incident raised serious doubts about Knight's leadership. It had been obvious for some time that Suge was more concerned with how he looked to the Piru Bloods, who made up his entourage, than about maintaining good relations with his performers and musicians. To end his relationship with a rapper who had performed on records that sold millions of copies over nothing more than a few pieces of fried chicken, though, was flat-out insanity. And more than a few people listened when RBX began to say that Suge was not only a bully, but a coward who couldn't fight a man his own size without thugs on hand to